Welcome, everyone. My name is Axel Michaelowa. I'm leading Perspectives Climate Research. We will start our webinar shortly. Just give people a bit of time to come in. Thank you very much for being with us. So today we will discuss the outcomes of COP29 in Baku. We will start with having a look at what were the key tasks of COP29, then at the strategy of the presidency, looking at what happened with regard to monetary pledges, which are part of every COP, so-called side deals, a short view on logistics, and then, of course, who actually participated. And, of course, the main focus of this webinar will be on the outcomes of the critical negotiation streams, the new climate finance goal, international carbon markets under Article 6, the mitigation work program, and the global goal on adaptation. And we will then conclude with an outlook towards the next COP in Brazil and beyond. And we will also allow questions and answers. So I would ask everyone to write questions in the question and answer stream. We don't have a chat stream enabled to prevent too much confusion. And of course, we will then answer certain questions. Each lead of the specific content session will choose a few questions until we reach the end of the time. So just to give an introduction who's speaking today, myself, I've been working on international climate policy for the last 3 decades, and I participated in 27 out of 29 COPs. Then we have Sherri Ombuya, who has been following the finance negotiations very closely and also contributed to some important research in the run-up to the COP. Then we have Juliana Keßler, who is leading our market mechanisms team, and she has been following Article 6 negotiations over the past couple of years. And last but not least, we have Laila Darouich, who is leading our negotiation team, and she has personally followed the adaptation stream. So where can we situate this COP? And of course, we have now 3 decades of international climate negotiations with ups and downs. And of course, there are the big milestone COPs like Kyoto in 1997, Paris in 2015. But this COP will be part of the more important ones because it had a really difficult task, the new climate finance goal, and it achieved an outcome. Of course, this outcome is not satisfying everyone, but it's an important aspect now for the years to come. And it will therefore be remembered as a really historical COP. Also, the COP was able to finalize the Article 6 rules, which have taken almost a decade of negotiations. So that means this is really an important COP with regarding its outcome, and therefore it is worth looking really into the details. So how did we start the path towards the COP? Of course, last COP, COP28 in Dubai, was having important decisions. On the first day already, it decided on the loss and damage fund. That was very unusual because usually everything is decided in a package at the end of the COP. And it was also important because for the first time there was a significant finance pledge from an non-Annex 1 country, from the UAE. The second important decision at COP28 was on the global stocktake. Of course, the global stocktake was a task that is really difficult to achieve in a way that everyone is satisfied. One can say everyone was equally dissatisfied with the global stocktake, which shows that it was a good negotiation outcome because, in a controversial topic, you shouldn't have an imbalanced outcome. The text has strong language on addressing gaps and utilizing science. It has complex wording on the fossil fuel reductions. And of course, the question to what extent it informs future NDC updates was a thorny question at COP29. And the COP28 was unable to decide on international carbon markets. Therefore, this, of course, became an important topic in COP29. Now, of course, COPs don't occur in a vacuum. They depend on the overall atmosphere, globally, economically, politically. And one can say that rarely a COP has been held in a situation which had so many crises at the same time. We have the geopolitical crisis. Everyone knows they have been worsening over the year. And that, of course, leads to a squeeze on public budget because the budget is now reoriented towards armament. We have seen significant issues with regard to global trade and protectionism, and that has, of course, also fueled an increase in debt. And again, this, of course, is difficult for climate policy because if debt rises, the availability of funding for addressing climate change is getting less. We have had many elections during this year. And of course, many of these elections have had outcomes that are not particularly conducive to a good international climate policy. And the resurgence of populist parties everywhere, and of course lately in the US, that of course doesn't bode well for climate policy because these parties usually think either climate change doesn't exist, or if they acknowledge that climate change exists, they don't want to really address it. And this has, of course, been exacerbated also by economic crisis in parts of the world, particularly in Europe. And then we've seen the climate crisis really hit hard this year. We have an increase of temperature that has already surpassed 1.5 degrees over the first 10 months of the year. So everybody who is working on these data sets says it's very likely that the entire year will exceed 1.5 degree. We have seen significant heat waves, wildfires, flooding, and of course we've seen massive impacts on lives and property, even in countries where you would think that they should be well prepared, most lately in Spain. So, of course, an explosive cocktail of crises that are the backdrop of what was negotiated at the COP. We had, as usual, certain big events in the run-up to the COP. The week in New York where the UN General Assembly is meeting, and this time it was combined with a summit for the future. But that summit only gave relatively general statements on climate change. And then we had the pre-COP, which has now become over the past years really a focus of the presidencies who try to then work on the most critical negotiation items to already have a kind of preparation that allows to go more smoothly during the actual COP. And the presidency focused on 4 elements: the finance goal, where we saw no real movement. On Article 6, already at the pre-COP, there was a quite positive mood on flexibility by major parties. Mitigation, the discussion was very difficult, and on adaptation, it remained on a rather generic level. And it's interesting because the outcome of the COP, of course, is reflective of such positions at the pre-COP. The presidency in its strategy had defined 2 pillars. The first one to enhance ambition, and that would of course relate to revision of NDCs, the development of national adaptation plans, and the submission of the biennial transparency report, which are due this year. And the second pillar related to what they called enabling action. And of course, there the new climate finance goal was a critical element. So overall, one can say it was a good choice of the strategy, not too many far-fetched aims. But of course, the presidency also did several blunders that made it more difficult for them. For example, they'd repeated several times that Azerbaijan as a host country will continue to exploit the beautiful natural resources and that these natural resources are a gift of God, which of course was angering many actors who think that we need to get rid of fossil fuels to address climate change. Also, of course, the country is having an authoritarian government, which meant that civil society couldn't really express itself. There was no demonstration outside of the venue, and that's now the third year in a row that this happened. And of course, it's problematic because civil society participation is a crucial ingredient of a successful COP. The presidency also said quite early on that it was not really interested to negotiate a so-called cover decision. In the past, we've seen several COPs, for example, that one in Glasgow, that put a lot of emphasis on the cover decision. This is a mixed bag because sometimes the cover decisions then can become so important in the negotiations that not enough time is left for the actual decisions in the different negotiation streams. I think in hindsight, it was wise not to put focus on a cover decision. The presidency really focused on the four elements that were already discussed at the pre-COP. So the highest priority was the climate finance goal, and the presidency defined ministerial pairs. So this was a pair from Australia and Egypt, already with some past experience in the topic. So overall, a good choice. And of course, important that the priority was really put at the right place. Second priority was Article 6, the market mechanisms. And this was led by ministers from New Zealand and Singapore, both countries quite engaged in international carbon markets and with a lot of past experience. The third key element, mitigation, so that of course would relate to increased ambition for the upcoming revision of NDCs, led by Norway and South Africa. Also, both countries that are sufficiently engaged in mitigation, but not really the heavyweights, which could then be seen as biased. And the fourth stream, adaptation, which was to develop the indicators for the global goal on adaptation in the two-year UAE Berlin Work Program, led by ministers from Ireland, Costa Rica, a bit less relevant. So how did the negotiations start and what was the overall spirit? One can say that from the beginning there was a lot of confrontation in many streams, and the first day saw an agenda fight that almost took half of the day. That was a record loss on time. Usually parties bring up new agenda items. This time there were 7 new agenda items, but the tradition means that none of these agenda items will be taken up, but that there will be some concessions on some other aspects. So it has become a kind of tradition, but this time it was really tough and serious. Also, for the first time I've seen COPs, there was discussions about boycotting the COP. 3 delegations announced such a boycott, but eventually it was only France that did it. And of course, the reasons were very varied. But of course, the French case shows that if the host country of a COP has a diplomatic grievance with another country, that's not the best starting point for a participation of that country. From day one, we saw a very constructive spirit in the Article 6 stream, so that continued in the spirit we'd seen already at the pre-COP. We have seen a new negotiation group emerge, the so-called G0, which are countries that have currently more removals than emissions and want to keep that status. Let's see how strongly the group will influence the negotiations. So far, it has not really made an impact, but of course, it's also not a very large group. We had in the last 2 days, of course, where the COP really always comes to the real action, a problem with the action of the presidency. There was not enough transparency and inclusiveness, and that meant vulnerable groups like LDCs and OSIS felt very frustrated. So they actually walked out of the negotiation room on Saturday of the second week. They eventually came back, but of course it was not really helping the atmosphere. In the final plenary, we saw rapid action by the president, gathering through the key decisions without really having a breath to take. That's, of course, a strategy that we've seen in the past as well. But this time it led to particularly emotional statements of large developing countries who were unhappy with the climate finance decision. What I should say that, of course, this is nothing completely new, but I would say the degree of emotionality was quite high this time. But none of the countries making such statements formally objected against the decision. And that's important because the media often report, oh, there are so many objections, so why do we have a consensus? And of course, consensus in UNSC language is a difficult animal. And we've seen in the past also many objections, but always the consensus was sustained, and this was no difference here. So overall, one can say there is a grudging acceptance of the compromise, particularly on climate finance. What is unprecedented is that one day after the close of the conference, you see an op-ed in an important international newspaper signed by the COP president complaining about certain country groups with regard to the eventual outcome. So this, of course, I would say is highly problematic because it means that the presidency didn't keep its neutrality that it should have, but that it actually wanted to air its problems officially. And I hope that this doesn't happen in the future in a regular fashion, because, yeah, we can really get into trouble that the presidency doesn't remain as neutral as it should be. With regard to logistics, this was clearly an above average COP, a large venue, well managed, no queues, good transport system. Of course, in the run-up to the COP, we had severe problems with hotel pricing. And of course, it's clear that there was a lot of money made, but that's unfortunately now a common practice. And it's unlikely that we'll see a normalization of this in the near future. What one should say is that the host city was really very welcoming. People in the street always smiling, trying to help. So that, of course, was giving a good atmosphere when it comes to the people of Baku. With regard to the monetary pledges, we have seen much less than in the past. You see here a list. We try to dig up everything that was made. So with regard to the formal funds of the convention, really only small sums. There were some larger pledges outside of the funds, noteworthy Singapore for Action in Asia, because again, Singapore is not part of the countries that usually provides climate finance. And then we had an interesting pledge also from the UK with regards to forestry. But overall, not very impressive. With regards to the NDCs and ambition, of course, which was one important pillar that we really didn't see much movement. We had 3 announcements from important countries. Of course, 2 of those were from the Troika, meaning they had hosted the COP previously and they will host the next COP. So with that, the UAE has become significantly more ambitious regarding the 2035 target, but the 2030 target has remained relatively unambitious. So the question is, how will they make the big shift within just 5 years? Brazil has a range in its NDC, so the upper end would be ambitious, the lower end less so, and of course a lot of dependence on forestry, and that of course will be a key topic in the next COP. And the highlight was the UK, because it really has a headline target which is highly ambitious. Of course, the policies remain to be seen whether they can actually achieve such an ambitious target. With regard to ambition, also, we saw emerging fights on important climate policy measures, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which was criticized very heavily by a number of emerging economies, and that was also put as an agenda item by China. So we saw at least a significant uneasiness with that. And another element that relates to ambition was that various developed countries negotiated with India to develop a just energy transition partnership with India, but the Indian government didn't want to take it up. We've seen, of course, earlier countries like South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal taking up such a partnership. So it's a bit disappointing that it has not been possible to bring this to further countries. With regard to the side deals of the presidency, there was a list of 13 initiatives in the run-up to the COP, of which the two ones which was most discussed were the Climate Finance Action Fund, a kind of new finance vehicle, and an initiative to try to have a truce of various armed conflicts that we have currently ongoing. But both of these initiatives didn't really get traction. We have seen some other initiatives that were signed by states and entities. To what extent they really will play a role after the COP remains to be seen. With regard to participation, formally, this is the second largest COP, totaling a bit more than 50,000 participants. NGO participation was significantly reduced, and for example, the Western institutions observers, they got only one badge per institution, and that raised a lot of irritation. And of course, many people who have been in the process for some time then thought, well, we need to participate, so we'll ask some government to register us as party overflow. And this now remains one of the really big categories, only slightly lower than the number of normal party delegates. What one should say, media interest was about as high as in the two preceding COPs. So with that, I would now move over to the key negotiation items, and I will now pass on to my colleague Sherri, who will look into the climate finance goal. Sherri, you have the floor.
Thank you, Axel. So COP29 was hyped with expectations as the COP that could decide the future of global climate finance. And the mandate for setting this new goal was enshrined in the decision that approved or adopted the Paris Agreement back in 2015. The negotiations ramped up this year with negotiation sessions covered or convened under an ad hoc work program, with the goal to develop a structure with core elements of a decision text. And there were several iterations throughout the year, including a version that was released just before COP by the co-chairs of this work program. And at the opening of COP29, so in the first session, the text saw fierce negotiations at Baku and was not agreed by both developed and developing countries. Already at this first session, the developing countries presented a united front under the Group of 77 and China. And it was clear already at this first stage that the negotiations would remain contentious as they were under the work program, and pitting developed and developing countries on what often would feel like irreconcilable positions against each other. So throughout the first week, there were several iterations of draft texts in response to the negotiators' feedback. And again, there was no indication or few indications of what a bridging or compromise could look like on this first week. And there was not much progress except on less difficult discussions related to access, transparency, disenablers, or barriers of climate finance. So I'll just quickly go through how these contentious issues look like prior to the COP, and also how they manifested during the COP. So at the heart of the contentions until the very end was the overall finance volume, or what is referred to as the quantum of the goal. At the start of the COP, as I said, G77 and China had a united front, and there they put forward an annual amount of $1.3 trillion, even if it was recognized that the needs of the developing countries are much higher. They also converged on $600 billion per year in public finance that would essentially be provided by developed countries to developing countries, and the rest mobilized by the developed countries, starting 2025. However, the developed countries did not mention any specific quantum until the second week, when the first annual amount of 250 billion was first floated. And in response to this, on November 20th, there was a press conference that was held by the chairs of the G77 and China, the Africa Group of Negotiators, and the like-minded developing countries, where they asked whether this was a joke. Another key issue that was contentious was how the goal would be structured. So during the negotiations, the developed countries had been arguing for the scale of finance that's required would only be reached if the NCQG was structured as a multi-layered global investment goal, which would include public finance and private sector investments, as well as international finance and domestic efforts. And the domestic efforts, including those of developing countries. They also saw the goal scaling up from the current base to a target amount at the earliest by 2035, similar to the 100 billion goal, which was set in 2009, and likewise allied for a scaling up period of 10 years to be reached by 2020. Related to the structure also was disagreements on whether the NCQG would include finance for addressing loss and damage alongside mitigation and adaptation, which developing countries emphasized would be reflective of their needs and priorities. There's also the issue of who would be mandated to contribute to the NCQG. So developed countries pointed to their own fiscal constraints and the enormous amount of finance required, as Axel has already highlighted, and argued that a number of emerging economies, primarily China, with their growth in wealth and the aggregate emissions accumulated over the last 30 years, should be compelled to contribute to the NCQG. However, this is something that the developing countries firmly rejected, insisting that the convention and the Paris Agreement had mandated developed countries to provide the finance. Again, related to this was then who would receive finance. So with the push to expand the contributor base, there was also a call for narrowing the countries that would be targeted by the limited public finance support, primarily to countries that were seen as most vulnerable, so small island developing states and least developed countries. And this, again, developing countries argued was against the eligibility of all developing countries to receive financial support, which is a core principle of the Convention and Paris Agreement, even while they recognized the special circumstances of SEEDs and LDCs. So in this first week of the COP, the SEEDs and LDCs mentioned that they would call for a minimum allocation floor of $39 billion and $220 billion annually, respectively. But as we'll see, this did not really end up in the agreement. Another key issue was that since the goal had to be set based on the lessons learned under the 100 billion goal, that it would be necessary to address its shortcomings. So here, primarily not just looking at the quantum of finance, but also the quality of the finance provided to developing countries, and specifically how concessional the funding will be and how simplified it would be for the countries to access the finance. So as I've mentioned with access, this was one of the areas that had the most convergence on the first week. But yeah, we'll see how this plays out in the text. Another issue was regarding the transparency arrangements. So developing countries saw the NCQG as an opportunity to highlight the need for a harmonized definition of climate finance, as the current working definition that's been floated, for instance, through the Standing Committee on Finance is viewed to be vague. And in the various text iterations that came out, there was some language around an exclusion list. So for instance, what not to count as climate finance, such as market loans provided at market rates. So yeah, this just briefly highlights what was contentious, not just on the first week, and as Axel, and also, sorry, not just at the first week, but also under the work program. And as Axel mentioned, the decision was quickly gaveled through on the first, at the end of the second week. And this was followed by protests from countries about the lack of ambition in the climate finance outcome and lack of trust in the process. So what was decided? On the quantum, the agreement calls on all actors to work towards scaling up climate finance for developing countries to a headline figure of at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. So in doing so, it frames the 1.3 trillion per year target pushed for by developing countries as an aspirational target and does not really clarify any separation between provision and mobilization, as the developing countries also had pushed for. The text also extends the previous 100 billion goal to 300 billion dollars per year by 2035, with developed countries taking the lead. And it mentions that this finance would come from a wide variety of sources, both public and private, bilateral and multilateral, as well as alternative sources, and encourages developing countries to contribute towards the goal on a voluntary basis, and also highlights specifically South-South cooperation. And while they would do so to not compromise their status as recipient under the NCQG. So essentially that all countries would be eligible, all developing countries would be eligible to receive finance. The text also acknowledges the special needs of seeds and LDCs. However, it does not have the minimum allocation flows which they had been pushing for. Again, related to this quantum, it does not specify how much of it would be provided as grants-based or concessional finance, which again was a key demand of the developing country groups, who had highlighted the importance of the NCQG not worsening the indebtedness in whatever modes of financing would be agreed. So based on this, several developing countries have already registered their disappointment on the quantum. And we see that the contributor base is slightly expanded, given that voluntary contributions of developing countries would count towards the goal. Related to the scope of the NCQG, the agreement does not really provide for sub-goals on loss and damage, adaptation and mitigation. And specifically on loss and damage, while it acknowledges the scale of loss and damage and the need to increase public and grant-based resources, as well as highly concessional finance, it does not make any commitment to providing specific funds for loss and damage. The agreement also recognizes the role of multilateral climate funds and the operating entities of the financial mechanism. So this would include the Green Climate Fund, as well as the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And it decides that there should be a significant increase of finance that's provided through them towards the quantum, and specifically that they would at least triple annual outflows from the funds from 2022 levels by 2030. So based on this, some observers note that this may be a way of securing finance for loss and damage, but then again, the fund was only for responding to loss and damage was only operationalized last year and confirmed this year. So it's a bit, so that means there are no outflows in 2022, and this leaves it a bit open to interpretation. Lastly, on transparency, the Standing Committee on Finance is identified as the key body to report on the collective progress towards all elements of the decision. And this is unlike the 100 billion goal, in which, to understand progress, there was a reliance on external reports, primarily from the OECD, which was highly contested by developing countries and observer groups, including civil society, based on the different accounting approaches and methods used. Related to this, the agreement does not have any specific climate definition or exclusion list, which again means that there would likely be some contestations around the accounting of this new goal recurring. So what can we expect in the new year after the agreement that has been, after this agreement? One, the NCQG emphasizes the urgent need to increase ambition and action, and it also highlights the financial needs of the developing countries. In fact, when you look at the context sections of the decision, it highlights the adaptation finance gap, which already exceeds the 300 billion that is now agreed. And given the strong and critical reactions we've seen from developing countries, such as India at the closing plenary, developed countries, it's felt that developed countries have not put forward an ambitious finance or tried specifically through the agreement to enhance the quality of finance, despite the high hopes that were pegged on the NCQG. So we'll now see, as countries develop their NDCs and submit them early next year, how much ambition will be enshrined in their national targets. The agreement also establishes what is called the Baku to Belem to 1.3 trillion roadmap, which is a process that is to be led by the COP29 and COP30 presidency to present a report at COP30 and ideally parties would discuss through this process how to scale up both the quantity and quality of finance towards the achievement of this 1.3 trillion headline number. So it could be an opportunity where some of the open questions around the NCQG could still be discussed depending on how countries agree to cooperate. However, because the modalities have not been agreed upon and are not clear at this point, it's also likely that the report and process is contested by the parties and they might revert to their entrenched positions. So we'll remain to see how much we can make progress towards this goal through that process. So on our end, some of the topics and issues we think it would be critical to look at over the next year would be, as a starting point, how we can increase adaptation finance. So not only noting that the growing needs exceed the flows, but also parties had agreed on 2025 as a target year to double climate finance. So it will need to be seen how we can really move forward adaptation finance without sidelining loss and damage, where the finance needs are really high. It could also be a key topic for the Baku to Belem roadmap to address. Secondly, is also having more clarity on the role of different actors, such as public finance institutions, in operationalizing the goal in such a way that we can give more confidence as to how they'll take responsibility for their different roles within the NCQG. Lastly, recognizing the scale of the finance that's required, as well as the call now of the NCQG for inclusion of alternative sources. One thing to look at could be how to deploy or move forward different innovative sources of finance, whether it's solidarity levies, taxes on global wealth, as have already been put forward, but have so far been non-starters, but especially due to lack of political will in certain areas, and how this can be deployed at both international and national level to really meet the climate finance gap. So if you're interested in working with us, feel free to scan the code there and also to reach out to the contact that's provided on the slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherri. Now we'll continue to Article 6 and I pass the floor to Julie.
Yeah, thank you, Axel, and welcome. So on the next slides, I will dive into the Article 6 negotiations at COP29. And Article 6 covers both market-based approaches under 6.2 and 6.4 and non-market approaches under 6.8. And in my slides, on my slides, I will really focus on 6.2 and 6.4. And I also have to mention that Article 6 negotiations have been quite technical over the last years, as it is really about the detailed functioning of these market-based approaches. So also let me start with what have been the key differences between parties on Article 6.2. And Article 6.2 is really about a further guidance, like a detailed accounting and reporting framework for market-based cooperation between multiple parties, two parties, or a party and an entity. So different constellations are possible here. And yeah, what have been the main fault lines, basically? So for authorization to be provided by the host country, it was about whether there should be detailed or limited guidance on the timing, content, and also format of authorization, and on the question whether changes to authorization or even revocation of an authorization should be possible. And the latter obviously has a huge implications for investment certainty, which is why many private sector stakeholders were particularly interested in this question. Then on the first transfer, so the specification of first transfer is really what triggers the corresponding adjustments to avoid double counting. And there the question was whether this needs to be further specified in the case of authorization of mitigation outcomes for other international mitigation purposes. So other international mitigation purposes in brief OIM includes voluntary use through the voluntary carbon market or COSIA use, so for the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. And in that case, you have multiple possible triggers of the first transfer, which could be authorization, issuance, use, or cancellation of the mitigation outcome. And some parties wanted to discuss this further. On the agreed electronic format for reporting the annual information, which is quantitative information, there the question was really, should we already have a final updated, like a final AEF at this point of time, or should we continue working with an updated draft that is to be further tested and reviewed over time? Then supplementary information. Some parties, like here specifically the EU, felt very strongly about having further information, upfront information available on the cooperative approaches. And they pushed for this information to be provided. So there was discussion whether it should be provided voluntarily versus mandatorily. Yeah. And then the treatment of inconsistencies in both ITMO data, in the consistency check, and in the technical expert review of the different Article 6 reports, whether there should be detailed guidance on flagging those inconsistencies, and then also actual consequences, or no guidance at all. And the main crunch issue was the question of the international registry and its functionalities and its interoperability with other registries. So should the international registry only be sort of an accounting registry that allows for pulling and viewing information, but there is no issuance in it? Or is it actually like a transactional registry that also allows for issuances into it? So there was really this huge divide between EU, the Environmental Integrity Group, and the UK and the African Group, and other parties on the one side that really wanted to have, you know, all functions and the transactional and issuance into the international registry. And on the other hand, the US, the like-minded developing countries, LMDC, and the Arab Group that wanted to have a pure pulling and viewing registry functionality. Moving to the differences on 6.4. So Article 6.4 stipulates the rules for the new mechanism, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, basically the successor of the Clean Development Mechanism. And there were more items negotiated. On the slide, I focus upon the more contested issues, which were the authorization again. So here, the timing of provision of the authorization statement was contested, whether it should be as early as possible or at any time in line with the national prerogative of parties, whether in the absence of an authorization statement, there should be an automatic tagging of non-authorized Article 6.4 emission reductions as so-called mitigation contribution units. and whether already issued mitigation contribution units can later on still be authorized, so basically post-issuance. And if so, what would be the impact on the NDC and also on the value of the adaptation fee that is due normally at issuance. And on the mechanism registry, similar questions as for 6.2 registry infrastructure. Here also the interoperability was quite contentious. So should it be possible, for example, to transfer authorized Article 6.4 ERs out of the mechanism registry? And also, what is the link? Should there be a link between the mechanism registry and the party registries under Article 6.2? So what are the outcomes of the Article 6 negotiations at COP? First of all, it's a great achievement that we have an outcome for all three Article 6 items, so 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. At COP28 last year, we only had an outcome for 6.8. And for Article 6 in general, this also means that the long negotiations on detailed rules and guidance since Marrakesh in 2016 comes to an end. So 9 years of negotiations. There's going to be further work on the implementation. I come back to this later on, but the Article 6 rulebook is now complete. And what are the concrete outcomes for Article 6.2? So on the process for authorization, we have now an agreement that there can be 3 components to an authorization. So authorization of cooperative approach, authorization of IPMIs and entities, and that the process can either be like a single consolidated authorization or a sequential process. Then on the content, this is really a major achievement for improving the quality of authorization, also those authorizations that we are already seeing out there, particularly the unilateral ones. We have an agreement on a long list of elements, and some of these elements are particularly important for tracking and accounting, such as the duration of the authorization, then the first transfer specification, and the mandatory specification of the authorized use. And also that information on circumstances in which changes may occur need to be provided, and the process for avoiding double counting in these cases. So this is great news. And on the format, the Secretariat is to develop a voluntary standardized template for the authorization, and the authorizations and updates to them are to be stored on the centralized accounting and reporting platform. When it comes to the changes, a compromise was reached. So basically, parties shall not apply or affect already changes to already first transferred outcomes, unless specified in terms and conditions of the authorization by cooperating parties to avoid double counting. So we have an ex-ante specification of the conditions under which changes can be done, and the process, and there is a process to be applied to them. And yeah, also with the requirement that avoiding of double counting needs to be avoided, this should really be sufficient to reassure activity developers that there cannot be any rogue revocations. On the first transfer, it was agreed upon a time limit until when a transfer must be recorded, which is latest 1 year before the biennial transparency is due. And this was basically agreed upon to account for corresponding adjustments. And it's an important safeguard, to really ensure for proper accounting within the NDC period. On supplementary information elements, as mentioned already before, this was really important to the EU. There have been attempts to clarify what the definition of a cooperative approach, but this section could not be retained in the final decision text. And instead, so the only achievement is basically this agreement. The parties are requested to include further elements in the updated initial report. So it's not a shell requirement. And yeah, in general, this section was really contested by countries like LMDC and the Arab group. On the agreed electronic format, here we also have a win basically from LMDC and Arab group, so countries that supported the further testing the further updating of this updated draft agreed electronic format, so no final version yet. And further improvements will basically be done on a report that is to be a technical paper that is to be prepared by the Secretariat, and this will be discussed in November 2028. On sequencing and timing of reporting, there we now have an agreement that specifies that the initial report must be submitted prior to or in conjunction with the annual information. So there's no reference anymore to that the review needs to be successfully done before the AEF can be submitted. On the process for identifying, notifying, and correcting inconsistencies, so we have quite some flagging and disclosure requirements that were agreed upon. For example, on the annual information, inconsistencies must be corrected. So this is a shall requirement. The party really needs to submit a revised agreed electronic format. There is now a definition of what inconsistency means and how it should be understood. On the Article 6 technical expert review, if there are identified significant and persistent inconsistencies, these must be displayed on the centralized accounting and reporting platform, including the duration of non-responsiveness. So these are quite stringent requirements, apart from when it comes to the use of those ITMOs that have been identified as inconsistent. Here, parties are only requested not to use those, so it's not a shall requirement. And then we come to the compromise that has been reached on the functionalities of the international registry, and this was really key, that we have overall an Article 6 decision at COP29, and this is also where ministers got involved to actually reach this agreement. And it's now specified that we will have a connection from the mechanism registry under 6.4 and party registries to the international registry, and that it must allow for both, so pulling and viewing of information, but also for actual transfers of authorized Article 6.4 emission reductions as ITMOs. And the core compromise was these additional registry services that are to be provided by the Secretariat, if requested, that can issue mitigation outcomes as units and then transfer them to the international registry. So it's important that there are no issuances into the international registry directly. On Article 6.4, we had two decisions. The first one was already reached on the first day of COP. And basically that decision took note of the adopted standards. So the standards are important methodological guidance documents for developing methodologies under the new mechanism, the Article 6.4 mechanism. And it took basically the last 3 years. It took the supervisory body to develop them, to agree upon them. They have been rejected at previous COPs. And then now this year, they really took this decision to make those documents standards. So this basically meant that they did not require approval by parties anymore formally, but it's more like the SBM asked for an overall endorsement of the approach chosen by the supervisory body, which was basically granted by parties with this decision on 11th of November. And with that decision, they also took note that the supervisory body will expeditiously elaborate the standards while ensuring regulatory stability. And at the same time, the supervisory body of this mechanism was also requested to expedite work on standards, tools, and guidelines, and to accelerate the revisions of CDM baseline and monitoring methodology. So this means now they can really go into the implementation, the supervisory body and its methodological expert panel, the MEP, and apply those standards at the standard level. So at the tool level, really, when it comes to additionality, when it comes to baseline, when it comes to downward adjustment. So you see at the bottom the box on prioritized methodological products for next year. And also on which activity types or which methodologies will be focused upon first in 2025. Further outcomes of 6.4 include that host parties are encouraged to provide the authorization statement now as early as possible. And the authorization statement is to contain information, either specification of they want to fully or partially authorize Article 6.4 emission reductions, no authorization, or that they allow issuance as mitigation contribution units and then later on want to authorize them. And in that case, the SBM got a new mandate to now consider whether there is a need for a time limit by when the statement should be provided. And the SBM will report back to parties at next COP. On the Article 6.4 mechanism registry, there is an agreement on a voluntary connection between party registries and the mechanism registry that allows for transfer of authorized Article 6.4 emission reductions and also the pulling and viewing of data. So important is that there's not going to be any transfer of mitigation contribution units out of the mechanism registry. And there was also an agreement on the transition of CDM afforestation and reforestation projects and programs, and an agreement on rules and timelines for those transition requests. Article 6 beyond the negotiations, so there were quite some announcement at COP. Norway, for example, announced that they earmarked a total of $770 million for acquisition, thereof $685 million for the Norway global emission reductions, and $50 million for the Article 6 fund of the Asian Development Bank. Then GGI introduced already in October its carbon transaction facility and announced that it really aims to get to US dollar of 0.5 billion US dollars, and that it for readiness and for a transaction window, and that members have to contribute to both windows. So Norway and Sweden have already signed up and established funds under it, for example. Then we have the Qatar-based Climate Action Center of Excellence that announced the setup of an Article 6 readiness tracker. And the World Bank has also provided or presented a general template for a letter of authorization at COP. And there were various announcements of new Article 6.2 bilateral agreements, and also the discussion of whether Article 6 could be, can we go back on the previous slide, whether Article 6 could play a role in the context of carbon border adjustment mechanisms was discussed. So coming to what the outlook for this year. What's important to mention is that basically now with the rule book agreed upon, parties decided that they only going to continue working on the Article 6.2 work program in 2028. So some aspects, like for example, also the accounting approaches for the application of corresponding adjustments were really moved to 2028. And we consider this problematic given the difference of the averaging and trajectory-based approaches. So this is really one of the key downsides, that this was now pushed to 2028. We often hear that everything is now concluded, but 2025 is for the 6.4 mechanism for PACM really a key year of implementation. So we're going to see the first issuances from transitioned CDM projects. There is a lot of methodological work that lies ahead for the supervisory body and its methodological expert panel. So there are around 34 methodological items and standards, tools that need to be developed, where a public consultation process needs to take place. Some SBM members have announced a timeline that we're going to see first new 6.4 methodologies in the second half of 2025. So that's quite ambitious. And yeah, there is going to be further work at next COP because from now onwards, the SBM chair and vice chair will report back to parties on the progress of implementation each year. So this will take place next year at COP. So what are the topics we are working on at Perspectives in the next year as well? So we will continue to closely follow and feed into the work of the supervisory body and the methodological expert panel based on our own methodological work on Article 6.4 alignment. Then we will continue to develop mitigation activity idea notes and design documents for Article 6.2 cooperative approaches, and capacity building for Paris-aligned pricing instruments and the establishment of processes and infrastructure. And if you're interested in our work, then please scan the QR code on the slide and you can reach out anytime. And yeah, I'm also curious to hear your questions and to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julie. And of course, I'm sure we'll get many questions on Article 6. So I'll now summarize very shortly what happened on the mitigation work program. So there was a serious conflict about, should actually the mitigation work program lead to a kind of guidelines for the NDC revisions that are derived from the global stocktake decision in Dubai. And of course, critical aspects would be the alignments of the NDCs with the 1.5 degree goal and the formalization of the renewable energy target, energy efficiency target, and the fossil fuel phase out within the NDCs. That, of course, was pushed by a number of developed countries. And many developing countries pushed back and said, NDCs are our national prerogative. We do whatever we want. The global stocktake is not a top-down agreement on what needs to be done on the national level. And anyway, we need a lot of finance as precondition for action. So that led to a purely procedural decision, which notes certain reports and essentially moves the contentious issue to another stream, which is the UAE dialogue negotiation stream. And I need to say that that stream didn't reach a conclusion, and therefore we will revisit the whole thing at COP30. So that's, of course, one of the less successful decisions of that COP. Now I'll move to adaptation, and Laila, you have the floor.
Thanks, Axel. So yeah, let's talk about our last topic today of adaptation, the global goal on adaptation specifically. So as a reminder, what happened last year at COP28? So COP28 marked the end of the first two-year work program on the GGA, which resulted in the adoption of the UAE framework for global climate resilience. And this framework aims to guide the achievement of the GGA and contains in total 11 targets, of which 7 are sectoral targets and then 4 are process-related targets. At COP28, we also launched a new follow-up work program with the aim to identify indicators for measuring the progress achieved towards these new framework targets. Then in Bonn at SB60 this year, negotiations really kickstarted on the so-called new UAE Belém work program on indicators. And it was decided in Bonn that the SB chairs are to prepare a compilation of mapping of existing indicators and also to convene technical experts to assist in the work on the mapping and also in the indicator selection process. Then over the summer and fall of this year, the Secretariat published then a list, an Excel file actually, of over 5,000 indicators that they gathered based on submissions from countries and relevant institutions. These 5,000 indicators were matched by the already identified 4,600 or a bit more indicators that the Adaptation Committee already in an earlier work of them identified. So we have a lot of evidence on adaptation indicators, and then the technical expert groups which have been formed had the exercise of going through this big list, looking for duplications, making sense of the data that they have, and a lot more. And these experts are in total 78 experts, and they are grouped in per target, so per sectorial target, and we have one group, and then there's one bigger group for all the 4 process targets. And then in October, we had a workshop that was held between the technical experts and parties, first to get to know each other and also to report on what the technical experts so far have been doing on the making sense of the Excel file and all the indicators and what they're seeing. And the conclusion was, definitely the technical experts need more guidance on what is the final outcome, what the parties want to see, how will the mapping take place, and what are the timelines needed. So this was already an indication of something that needs to be talked about at COP29. Then also 2 days before COP, the technical paper on transformational adaptation was published. This was something that was was part of the decision text at COP28, that transformational adaptation should be now taken up. But before talking about this, parties demanded to have a kind of technical paper to have a better understanding on the issue. And this was now even published 2 days before COP. So let's talk about the conflict. So the contested areas at COP were based on 3 topics. So we had obviously the topic on the UAE Belém work program that we talked about. And then we also had obviously there was another topic on the paragraph 38 of the CMA 5 decision of last year's COP on the GGA, which is about the implementation of the GGA and the UAE framework. And this was the second topic. And the third was then, okay, transformational adaptations. What do we do about this issue? So on the UAE Belém work program, the discussions focused on the inclusion of means of implementation, MOI indicators, specifically for finance indicators, which developing countries pushed for an inclusion of those, and developed countries refusing, stating this is out of the scope of the work program, saying that, the work program is only focusing on indicators for which targets have been defined in the UAE framework, and pushing back on that. Then there was also discussion on the nature of the final outcome of the work program. So what does it look like? What kind of indicators are we looking for? Do we look for global indicators, national level indicators, a mix of both? And then also, how many indicators do we want to have? Do we want to have one per target? Do we want to have one headline indicator and then supplementary ones, a bit more like the SDGs? Or how some parties also said 5 indicators or 10 indicators per target. So we had a lot of discussion on this number of the indicators. And then, as mentioned before, the guidance for the expert groups was also something that was discussed. So what are the deliverables that are expected from the technical experts? What are the timelines when they have to deliver this work, and so on. Then on paragraph 38, it was really about the review of the UAE framework. So when do we do a review? How do we do a review? When are we going to start talking about this? Then also a topic was the relationship between the GGA and the GST. How is the GGA feeding into the GST process? And then the third one was a reoccurring issue of the need for a standalone agenda item on the GGA, which developing countries stressed the need for. On transformational adaptation, there was basically a discussion, are we talking about this topic, yes or no? So there was reluctance from developing countries to engage on the topic, saying that the report, that I mentioned before, only came in too late. Basically, these 2 days before were not enough to review the text. Also saying that the content was highly technical, needs more time to digest, and also time with their scientists to go through the text. Saying that this is too premature to really talk about at this stage, and not wanting this to be in the decision text. Then developed countries and OASIS, one has to stress, really pushed, saying, okay, we discussed last year at COP28 that we will now talk about transformational adaptation. There was a mandate for that, and they really wanted to discuss it. So yeah, that was the main conflict around that topic. Yeah. And what we agreed on then in the end is on the UAE work program on indicators. On the finance indicator topic, there was a compromise with a rather soft language, pleasing, I think, both big sides, developed and developing countries to some degree, saying that there are indicators for enabling factors, including means of implementation. So enabling factors is something that developed countries often stressed in the past as they want to include this term. This is much broader than means of implementation, and then having this comma and then including means of implementation was of the kind of compromise of having both sides equally unsatisfied or as satisfied as possible. Then on the nature of the final outcome and the number of indicators, it was agreed to have a manageable set of not more than 100 indicators that are globally applicable, constitute a menu that captures various contexts, and really important, that parties can choose which indicators to report on, which personally we think is challenging, because then how do you really compare what countries are doing? But anyway, the targets and also then the indicators are not meant for comparison as per COP28 decision. So yeah, further there should also be used for aggregation, which is then relevant for the GST. And then on the guidance for the expert group, it was decided to have the consolidated list of indicator options, here stressing the word options, because it is clear that parties make the final decision on the indicators and the experts are only to give kind of their judgment. And this is to be submitted 4 weeks before SB 62, so in June next year. On the implementation of the GGA and UAE framework, the Arab group proposed in an intervention in the first week something that they called the Baku adaptation roadmap. This roadmap gives a vision for how to handle or how to plan the work on the GGA achievement after now this work program on indicators. And it sets out a list of, for example, workshops or high-level ministerial dialogues, and what they envision to what should happen for further advancing discussions on the GGA. And it was decided basically that the subsidiary bodies are to develop modalities for this work after COP30. Then it was also decided on respect to the GST connection that the final outcome of the UAE Belém work program would constitute as an input, source of input to the next GSTs. There was also a decision on having a Baku high-level dialogue on adaptation at all COPs in the future. The GGA is now a confirmed standing agenda item that was also agreed, and the review cycle for the UAE framework would start after GST2, and would the TOR considerations would start after 2025, so after COP30. On transformational adaptation, it was decided with a language on saying transformational adaptation is important, thereby including it, but further discussions are to be continued next year in Bonn and beyond. So basically no real engagement on the issue in the text. So next year, as an outlook of what is going to happen, we will definitely see with Belém being the end of the UAE Belém work program, that there will be heated negotiations on the final set of indicators. So having the work of the experts finalized, and then we're going really into the political discussions in Bonn, and then mostly in Belém. We will see this as a main topic. Then CMA 7 needs to also discuss what is happening beyond that, also now here referring to this Baku adaptation roadmap. And obviously the discussions on transformational adaptation are to continue. So in our team at Perspectives, we are looking for the topics that we are looking to work on next year are, for example, the mobilization of the UAE Belém work program outcomes, and how they can improve NDC adaptation targets without increasing reporting burden. This was mentioned by many developing countries as a main condition. for the indicators. Then now having this huge intel on all these indicators gathered from so many different sources, there could be made a nice analysis on adaptation metrics, looking at trends in these indicators, opportunities, common challenges. Then discussions on transformational adaptation revealed at COP29 that there is still a need for more understanding of case studies and examples of what is transformational adaptation, what activities could be examples of that, and what sets them apart from called incremental adaptation. Then in the launch of the Adaptation Gap Report, there was also an emphasis on adaptation actions so far not really delivering on expected results. So we think opportunity for next year would also to be looking into this topic. Why do adaptation activities so far don't deliver, and what are success factors and what are barriers? So diving a bit more into learning from the past. And then also one important topic that we think kind of a part of the answer of why adaptation actions probably don't always deliver on the expected outcomes is the importance of a sound climate rationale and incorporating future climate risks to first of all avoid maladaptation, but also to make sure that you have a sound design before you go into a project. And this is something we think could also be highly relevant for future discussions. So if you're interested in our work and would like to talk to us, then here or learn more, then first of all, you can look at the website as here the QR code shows, and then you can approach my colleague Marjorie or me for any further discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Laila. And now, in order to move to the questions, I'll summarize very quickly. So we have seen important decisions at the COP on climate finance, on carbon markets. Of course, these decisions don't satisfy everyone, but they are a firm basis for the development of international climate policy in the years to come. We had a bit of a weak underbelly when it comes to the mitigation work program and, of course, the deferral of the global stocktake dialogue and the just transition, because the controversies between developing countries and developed countries really blocked process. We had one good decision on the gender work program, which was now extended for a decade. And those of you who followed the process know that, of course, there's much more emphasis on balanced male-female representation throughout the process. So this will now, of course, continue to be pushed, and it's great that even with certain countries rolling back female rights and rights of other communities, this could be achieved. So now I'll just look into what will happen in the future. We have quite some understanding regarding the next COP. So it's clear that Brazil will put a lot of emphasis on the ambition of the NDCs and mobilization of finance. But of course, we need to see how much of this can actually be already set up in the run-up to the COP. It's clear that among those countries that have been hosting COPs in the last couple of years, Brazil will definitely be #1 when it comes to the number and the experience of people working for the presidency. And of course, the Minister of Environment, she has really high stature and is seen as an iconic figure. We have the host city, which is located in the rainforest, but of course, which will imply certain logistical challenges. So I'm expecting a bit of bumpy COP on the ground. We have the negotiations about the adaptation indicators. Laila has explained in detail where the problems lie. We need to get decisions on these deferred issues, like the dialogue on the global stocktake and the just transition. And what I found quite interesting, that the Brazilian presidency was very clear that they wanted to push fossil fuel phase-out language. which of course will not be seen very positively by a number of relevant countries, and which also Brazil is not such a good host country, because Brazil has a strong exploration drive for fossil fuels in their offshore region. So let's see how this plays out. For the following COP in 2026, there is now a fight between Australia and Turkey who can host the COP. Of course, currently I would very much prefer Australia, because Turkey, that would again be the same region, the same kind of regime, and not a very credible host, given that it has been pushing coal quite intensively in its electricity sector. Then we have the series of COP in Africa and again in Asia. So we already have the candidacy of India for the COP in 2028, which would definitely become the next global stocktake COP. And then now, as a result of the finance decision, it's clear that the NCQG review will dominate the COP35 in the year 2030. So with that, I would now like to close, and I would invite my colleagues who have been running the thematic streams to answer a few questions. We have now 10 minutes to go for these questions. So Sherri, let's start with you.
Thanks, Axel. So I see a first question here on what we meant in the first statement, that African countries requested emerging developing economies to volunteer funding and China agreed. So I think on the second week, there was a press conference, as I mentioned, that was held in reaction to the first quantum that was floated of 250 billion. And there, what I took was the representative from the AGN, I think, as well as the G77 and China, which is also chaired by an African state, mentioned that while they understand the NCQG has the responsibility, is enshrined under the Paris Agreement, where developed countries would provide countries to developing countries, they were willing to consider as an additional layer, which would include voluntary contributions from emerging economies. And as Axel pointed out in part of the contextual parts of this webinar, that the COP president in his webinar also highlighted that China had been engaging within the G77 and China group, and there they had indicated a willingness to contribute contribute finance, as long as the developed countries are willing to do more. But however, because the developed countries did not do more, then in the end, this willingness did not really show up. So that's what is implied in that. There's also a second question on our understanding on the paragraph 8, which alludes to the NCQG being an extension of essentially of the 100 billion goal. Well, I think for me, this is a bit open to interpretation. So on the one hand, sorry, just one second. Yeah, so on the one hand, I think there's an acknowledgement that the 300 billion could be a positive step in the sense that it is higher. It is 3 times higher than what this 100 billion goal was. However, there's also recognition that on the urgency of the climate finance needs for developing countries. So this inclusion of the 2035 element could be seen as pushing it too far out into the future, compromising the urgent need to deliver on this finance. This is just a brief statement, but Axel, I would also welcome.
Yeah, maybe to add, of course, that could be a hook to use the past definition of mobilized climate finance from the private sector, because currently the wording in the new decision is very broad and saying sources public and private. And of course, if this is defined loosely, then the target loses a lot of its relevance. So if one now says it's the extension of the goal, that means that the definitions of the previous goal also count. So we can have a narrower definition of what actually is a private contribution and has been mobilized. So maybe we can make a good use of this seemingly arcane provision. Great. Julie, do you want to take a question?
Yes, I can take two questions. So the first one I picked is, what is your perspective on the 6.4 removal standard? Are its requirements practical enough to enable large-scale project implementation? So to answer the first question, so we consider the removal standard under 6.4 so far sufficiently robust. However, the devil lies in the details. No? So now we're in the implementation phase, and there are many methodological products that still need to be developed, prepared, for example, post-crediting period monitoring, standard reversal, risk assessments, and remediation measures. So this is all outstanding. So we would really need to look at that in this year, how this is implemented. Enable large-scale project development. So I don't know whether that's related to jurisdictional crediting, for example. So it's important to mention that there is a concept note that is still to be also developed by the supervisory body on large-scale crediting. This includes jurisdictional, sectoral, and policy crediting, and that one has actually been deprioritized for next year. So let's see whether this will still be prepared next year, but definitely the other standards and tools that I showed on the timeline slide will be prioritized first. Then there was a question on Article 6. Is there clarity on how voluntary carbon market standards such as Gold Standard and Vera will be able to link with international registry? So yeah, the international registry, the 6.2 registry, is primarily a pulling and viewing registry. So this means that it can obviously mirror data that is, with the actual transfers and issuances happening in underlying private sector registries, including from different voluntary carbon market carbon crediting programs. Yeah.
Thank you. I would also like to take the question from Jigiga, whether carbon finance would count as climate finance. In an earlier version of the finance text, there was specific mention of carbon market qualifying that was deleted from the final text. But of course, now if one would, for example, look at mitigation contribution units that are not counted towards any buyer targets, I would think that we would see an acceptance of such carbon market funding under the climate finance. Of course, noting that there is no formal definition. Laila, do you want to take any of those questions?
No, actually, I thought there is one that I could give to you if you want. There's a question on that you see a lot in the press that the UNFCCC process has essentially been captured by the fossil fuel industry in fossil fuel countries. What are your thoughts on this? Maybe you would like to answer on that one.
Yeah, well, this has been now a long-standing criticism, especially of COPs that are hosted by oil-producing countries. I would say the process has not really been captured by such lobbyists. Of course, we've seen government delegations that include private sector participants from the oil and gas sector. We, of course, see large country pavilions that are promoting such industries. But yeah, a capturing of the process, we cannot really say that this is the case. I would sincerely hope that we, of course, get some host country that has no oil and gas interests. Well, Brazil will be better than the two past COPs, but it will not be perfect. Yeah, so far, unfortunately, I don't see a host country on the horizon who has no interest whatsoever. So there will always be some connotation, and of course some clever media found out that Azerbaijan was doing some gas deals on the side, like has been the case for the UAE in Dubai. So yes, I would say the process is certainly influenced by actions of these groups, but it is not captured. Good. With this, I think we are coming to the end of our second webinar. So, of course, if you feel you want to engage further with us, please don't hesitate to do so. I thank my colleagues for their input, the team for meticulous preparation. And of course, I'm looking forward to engaging with you over the next 12 months in the run-up to the next COP and hopefully the next post-COP webinar after a successful COP in Belém, Brazil. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.